So good morning all of you. Let me first of all welcome you to this workshop on assessing recent initiatives to promote China studies in India. As you can see from the program which has been circulated, we have a strong panel which includes not only Delhi-based scholars but also those who have traveled from other parts of the country and from outside India. So I welcome all the participants. Very warm welcome to all of you. As you are perhaps aware, we are currently marking the 50th anniversary of the Institute of Chinese Studies, and more accurately its precursor entity, China Study Group, which was set up in 1969. This is meant to be, partly celebratory, partly stock-taking, partly looking ahead. When we are looking at, various activities that can be taken up as part of ICS 50, we all agreed that there should be one component focusing on China studies in India. And we also felt that it should not be an exercise which will seek to undertake a comprehensive review of the state of the field when it comes to China studies in India, but it should be more targeted, more focused, looking specifically at the initiatives that have been taken during the last 5 to 10 years. As you're aware, these initiatives have been coming from the government, from public universities, private universities, various educational institutions, from foundations and trusts, from entities like the Institute of Chinese Studies, and from outside India. I think that last component is also very important, and we are specifically looking at that component this morning. Now, this exercise is being anchored by Professor Madhavi Dhampi, and we felt that as part of this exercise, which is ongoing, there should be a workshop. This workshop is an integral part of the study we are undertaking, examining initiatives linked to China studies in India. Now, this workshop brings together individuals, representatives of institutions in India and abroad who are engaged in advancing China studies in India. The objective is to have an exchange of views on what has been achieved so far, and that is not inconsiderable. Quite a lot of work has happened in recent past, but we'll also look at challenges that lie ahead and what remains to be done. We do hope that through this dialogue, this day-long dialogue, we'll come up with some concrete ideas and recommendations on how to advance China studies in India. We are today pursuing China studies in the country in a context which has changed radically with the rise and transformation of China and its leading role in the world. China matters far more today, bilaterally, regionally, and in the global context. India's own engagement with China has undergone a paradigm shift. India-China relations have become more important with the rise of both countries. In fact, from our own experience, since early 80s, 1980s, one has seen how this relationship has been completely transformed. Just to give you an example, when I was first in China and looking after functional exchanges between two countries, we have less than 12 Indian students in the country, in China. Today the number is in excess of 22,000, and it's expanding rapidly. China is for India a big opportunity, something which is at times underestimated, even while it is for us possibly the number one strategic challenge. The interest in China and India has increased manifold, and so has the appetite for information analysis on China. China scholars need to cater today not only to an academic audience and government, but also to the public at large, which is increasingly curious about developments linked to China. Unfortunately, we also have the problem of stereotypes and the huge gap that exists between perceptions about China and the reality of China. The negative discourse on the country has tended to persist and even proliferate. In fact, this is something which worries us a lot. The magnitude of change that has occurred in China domestically and its external profile, as also in India-China relations, is not adequately appreciated in India, even in China study circles. This changed and changing environment will have to be borne in mind as we explore the issues relating to expanding the presence of China studies in India, consider the gaps in the existing knowledge system, and review major challenges that we confront. We'll initiate our dialogue this morning with the keynote address by Professor Patricia O'Brien. We couldn't have someone more appropriate than Patricia to initiate this dialogue, given her own long-standing commitment, involvement with the cause of promoting China studies in India. It will be followed by an introduction by Professor Madhuri Thampi, she'll introduce the workshop. She's the convener of this workshop. So let's begin with the keynote address by Professor Patricia O'Brien. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashok, and well, it's really an honor to be here and to be asked to give this keynote. And it's also a humbling experience because I really wonder about my credentials in this. I have not held a job in China studies since I taught at ANU Australia in 1966. So no one has ever paid me for my thoughts, in case I should have some. However, where I would like to begin is the opposite to what the seminar is constructed at. We're looking, and Madhavi has been saying this for some time, we're looking here at and trying to assess critically the new initiatives in China studies. But this is not the first discussion we've had on China studies. During the 1980s, the small group that was the China Study Group couldn't stop talking about what was China studies. And there was a debate in China Report, famously a bit of to and froing, started by a collective statement. Then there was a piece by Professor Tan Chung, then one by Giri Deishinga. And when finally, I must say I'm repeating myself, I gave a keynote on the subject in 2011, I had to call it China Studies in India Mark III, because I really felt there'd been all these preceding statements which were very important, and which were not of all of one mind, but some of the problems are perennial, and I think they're going to need to be taken into account even as one moves forward. My own perspective is from my disciplinary perspective now. That is from sociology, what's called sociology here would be called elsewhere social and cultural anthropology, and some new thoughts that have occurred to me in the course of doing two pieces of recent work of my own. The first one is a very curious exercise I've been doing on the writers, on a journal, a learned journal of a learned society called the Anthropological Society of Bombay, which was founded in 1886 and effectively finished, though it existed in name, in 1936. And I was asked to write a sort of essay on the thinking about East and Southeast Asia as reflected in this journal. And that that is a very interesting project, as I would go on to say, from the point of view of sociology or anthropology as a discipline. It's something like, in the Indian context, it's almost inviting one to deal with a contradiction. As Giri Deshinkar said in one of those essays that I quoted from, Indians, now you may like to take issue with this, but Indians have shown no interest in countries other than India, academically speaking. And you can think about it. It's not that one can't find some posts and flags to raise at this point and that point. But the general position is that Indians prefer to work on India. So anyhow, in the course of this work on the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Bombay, I was drawn to reflections on late 19th century institution or something that flourished, particularly in the late 19th century, namely the learned societies. Their relationship with another social phenomenon, some overlap and some differentiation, the so-called friendly societies, which were also flourished in the late 19th century, and the darker side of this, namely the secret societies such as Freemasons, which I suddenly found were deeply involved in the history of people in India, from India. These were colonials, the British mainly, looking out, whose membership as Freemasons was part of the connectivity that connected in the whole of Asia, India as a fulcrum, and going further east. This is an amazingly unwritten history, and I have found myself deep in the secret handshakes, secret things, fancy costumes, and all sorts of amazing things, whereby you had a body of people interconnected in so many ways in the colonial service, in civil society as well, engaged in looking east. And here India was a sort of fulcrum, and it was the, by the way, you had in your book, Freemasons don't have an entry in the index.
Okay.
Yes. so that is our secret project for going forward. So this is the sort of atmosphere that one is looking at, the thought world, where India was a real fulcrum of thinking about the East and discoveries of the self of the West via the Orient, the labors of the Orientalists. Now, I brought this up to date in the essay that I was somehow compelled to write on the ICS at 50, because we had a mythology. Everyone likes a myth of origin, particularly anthropologists. You have to have a myth of origin. Peoples have to have them. Nations have to have them. And we have been building up our myth of origin for our beginning 50 years ago on the lawns of Sabra House. But this Indian Council of World Affairs was like the last gasp of the, perhaps the independent, as it were, learned societies or in civil society. And eventually it succumbed, I suppose, that would be not a very kind word, to what had been the death knell of learned societies as an institution. Not quite the death knell, they still continue at the Asia Society, so many societies. But this space in civil society has been compromised by things which are good in their own way. One is professionalization. In anthropology, there were no professional anthropologists, there was no taught anthropology, till that same decade where you began the teaching of Chinese and China studies in the universities in India, namely in Calcutta. And the government bureaucratization, that is that the study of other societies, in this case China, comes under the wing of ministries and government bureaucracies. And government bureaucracies, they ought to be great providers of money. We're continually asking for more, but they have their own agendas and their own ways of doing things. And finally, when one has the phenomenon of what among anthropologists is called methodological nationalism, that one is looking at all these questions from the point of view of the nation state within which we now reside, vis-a-vis another nation state, in the case of China. And though we keep on talking about civilizational aspects, we are actually dealing, as you said, with two countries, India and China, which were not really there. They have their own myths of origin, which means there was an India, we know what it is, we can say what it is, there was a China, and how were their two histories connected? Well, was there an India? Was there a China? What were they like? And is this the way of going about it? So I will, all our exercises along these lines have been examples of confessionalism. That is, there's always a confessional thing, what I went through as a student. I will forget that, the pains and the joys. And go on to talk about the sociological or the anthropological perspective. So as I say, apart from the two exercises I've just mentioned, I've also been engaged in writing, in history writing of sociological and anthropological thought in India. And this, of course, is where the two enterprises meet. So what has come out of my reflections as a sociologist, it really begins with an endorsement of Giri's perspective, which you can now contradict me on. That is that first of all, the practice of anthropology throws into relief the idea that Indians do not seem to have a very self-conscious tradition of studying other societies as their own, excepting, in a way, Europe or America, which remain the implicit, if not explicit, together, mirror for self-reflection. That is the default other. In India, there's been very little interest in other societies in Asia, let alone elsewhere in the world. And from this perspective, I might say that the brief moments of Pan-Asianism, which have occurred in the early 20th century in particular, or under British colonial rule, well, that was still colonial period, but they deserve special attention. There's a wonderful chapter in Tansen's book on the Pan-Asianists. Now, the general lack of interest in other, including Asian societies, has given rise to a great deal of soul-searching on the part of Indian sociologists of an anthropological persuasion. For it's part of the self-definition of anthropology that one must understand the other in order to know oneself, or to understand what human society is about. On the other hand, Indian sociology, like Chinese sociology on its part, has seen its relevance in address to the immediate problems of Indian society, and all comparative reflection, such as it is mediated through the prism of the fashionable Western social science of the day. Almost no one, since the initial enthusiasm for American-style area studies after wars with China and Pakistan, thinks it important to invest in studies of other societies, except for the narrowest and most pragmatic of reasons. geoeconomic or geopolitical, let's name them. And shamefully, the most enabling programs of South-South academic collaboration have been facilitated in India by non-South agencies, whether it be in the Netherlands, Japan, the Asia Scholarship Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and so on. On later reflection, I also thought that actually China has done more, in money terms I should think, for the development of Indian scholarship on China than the Indian government has done itself. Would you contradict me? In terms of the exchange of students, the facilities and so on, there is a hell of a lot of difference. So this brings me to another reflection, which is also voiced by China Studies students. That is that people Indian scholars are occasionally, intermittently exercised by the challenge of developing an independent, non-Western or so-called indigenous social science or practice of whatever their own discipline is. Yet they, notwithstanding this concern for an independent or claiming an independent standpoint, they must reconcile to the fact that professional recognition in a global context is dependent, and in India itself, which refracts from global recognition, is dependent on conforming to global paradigms. So that, in the international system of knowledge, Indian social scientists remain credible informants on their own society, but can rarely stake a claim to an independent role as producers of theory, innovators of methodology, or interpreters of other non-South Asian cultures. I think perhaps when we look for counter-examples, we look at things like subaltern studies. Hooray, something happened in social science in India which has had global recognition. I might add here that when I first came to India, I luckily landed in the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Simla. And I think I saw there the last of the Sino-Tibetan Indological framework, where people were interested in China for some other reason besides geopolitics and geoeconomics. And it was for, as you know, looking back to the early 20th century, partly for the recovery of India's own history via Chinese and Tibetan sources. And there we had people whose perspective was completely different. Of course, like Niharanjan Rai, whose famous work on the Brahman gods in Burma showed him already looking out. He should be recognized in India's new Act East and Indo-Pacific enterprises. Similarly, China scholars in India often claim to seek an independent point of view, whether from the narrow perspective of Indian strategic and security objectives, or from a broader civilizational perspective in dialogue with other Asian traditions. However, as already observed, while a number of Indian scholars have won global recognition as commentators on India-China relations, few, except those, with apologies, already assimilated to the Western Academy, have achieved recognition as China scholars per se. In any case, limited access to Chinese materials and, for the most part, inadequate command of the language has meant that knowledge of China continues to be filtered through Western and primarily American sources. There's other things I'd like to say on this, but I'll leave it there. Another point. One might observe that Indian sociologists and anthropologists have continually reflected, often with uneasiness, on their relationship to the state. On the one hand, there's a critical stream within sociology that attributes to the state responsibility for what used to be fashionably called in those days the development of underdevelopment within a world system of dependency. And it's the job of the conscientious sociologist to tear away the veil of self-deception, to reveal how power operates to shape knowledge, both globally and locally. On the other hand, given that the state is, for us, the major source of research support and funding till date, but now we're looking at a different scenario in the rest of this seminar, many Indian sociologists see it as their prime duty to focus on immediate social problems, and to do so in a way that yields practical policy recommendations. Sometimes we've joked on this. I once wrote a paper on Mao's theory of physical education. And for that I read everything I could on the Indian martial arts, which took me on a wonderful trip. And we then had to face up to the faculty whose president of the Institute of Economic Growth, whose president, Professor Manmohan Singh, he wasn't Prime Minister then, had said that at the end of every paper there should be a policy recommendation. And I sat down and thought, now what is the policy recommendation that might come out of that essay? And frankly, I was stuck for words. So scholarship for the sake of scholarship, or with long-term rather than short-term objectives and outcomes, cuts little spice with potential sponsors, whether government, non-government, or even, for the most part, international agencies. As a result, research orientations are unrepentantly fashion-driven, for the most part. And worse still, that there's a distinct danger that the researcher may end up forever dancing to the official's tune, and unfortunately often out of step with that tune, because that tune can also change before you've started dancing. So while that one realizes that independence can easily become an excuse for ivory tower isolationism, like we accused the old sinologists of when I was studying, it said that Arthur Waley couldn't speak Chinese, is that right? And some of the most famous sinologists among our teachers, they couldn't speak to a living Chinese. They didn't need to. They didn't think they needed to. Or we're just plain laziness with knee-jerk responses to issues of immediate public concern, which may give only superficial and media-driven scholarship. This is what we used to call nudging each other, the spotlight professors. So there's news now, then the radio has someone making a statement on it, which is all very well in the public sphere, but is that all that the China studies should be aiming at? So sociologists are routinely called to comment on any and all social issues, particularly those that defy the rational analysis of economists, political scientists, and other sensible people. Similarly, China studies scholars used to tend to become instant experts on any or all aspects of China's politics, society, culture, international relations, you name it. Fortunately, I think we can say that's something that is now changing, with the possibility that we have fragmentation instead of unity. As a final point of reflection, from my long innings as a teacher of sociology and editor of one of the main sociology journals, I'd like to revert or come on to one of my favorite themes. That is the question of discipline. When I was a student and we emerged from this very sinological training, never getting into modern history or contemporary questions, we also used to think that we've ended up without a discipline. And all my contemporaries spent the rest of their lives trying to begin at the beginning within a recognizable discipline. because that was not something that was provided. You learn the language, you cover the text, and you're done. So every research project requires a theoretical anchorage, unfortunately often overdone in our universities, and methodological self-consciousness, also overdone. But all too often this is substituted, and I feel strongly on this, by what passes as common sense. Whether the common sense of everyday experience or the common sense of received everyday knowledge. Several of the subfields in which I've worked, especially those on the disciplinary margins, are those in which people think they know the answers before they've done the work and never thought of questions of methodology. That might be true of sociology of the family, in which I'm supposed to be an expert, where people know they live in families, therefore they can so they can tell you about families as a unit of social existence. Of women, well, we all think we know. We can say a lot about being women. Now we allow sometimes men to talk about what it might be to be a woman. In literature, so many people think, and that was in fact the main trajectory of people emerging from our China studies in those days. They thought they'd done the language, you do literature. And I myself followed that trajectory without ever having studied literature per se. It's outrageous, actually. Of cinema, in this country, everyone thinks they know about cinema, and they can speak on it, and what they say is valuable, and of the popular arts. And so common sense seems to, there seems to be a sort of arrogant amateurism where the authenticity of personal experience and common sense smothers attempts at disciplinary rigor or even the self-understanding that you needed. Similarly in the China studies field, and I think now you will be seeing a difference, research students writing dissertations on social science themes like urbanization, industrialization, migration, gender, the family, literary movements, intellectual movements, and so on, do so with no critical awareness of the comparative or theoretical dimensions of their work. In the old Oriental Studies model, familiarity with Chinese language sources was effectively the substitute for social or human sciences disciplinary training. Regrettably, it would sometimes seem the case that many China studies researchers in India lack even the fig leaf of language competence. That, again, I think we'll see is changing. It still remains a problem. So I think I've probably talked as long as I need to or should. I had many more points to make, but our time is running short. But I did want to put the problem out. The first is language or discipline, or language plus language and discipline, whatever it might be. And there are several models for doing this, but they do not necessarily work. And there have been bureaucratic attempts and institutional attempts to have the one or have the other, and then to forge their connections. But I think people will say that is not there. So for those students who want to learn the language with an eye on employment, purpose-specific diploma and certificates courses should be adequate preparation and more than efficient than the pretense of a university liberal arts degree. But given the few native Chinese speakers employed in Indian educational institutions, there are more now, such basic needs need to be supported and supplemented by sojourn in China or a Chinese-speaking location. This is something that you'll go into. But importantly, Chinese language training in itself does not guarantee analytical skills and research competence. And as I mentioned earlier, this includes in the field of literary research, which it just appears to be a natural extension of university-level language courses that typically include study of literary texts. So while many individuals as scholars in India, as elsewhere, succeed in re-educating themselves, others seem quite oblivious to the challenge. And I myself look back at shudder at the thought of the things that I've done in the past, writing a 20,000-word paper on the Chinese poet Tao Yuanming, or a 300 literary biography of a modern Weimar poet, without a better training than Anglo-Australian high school education in literature. And that is perhaps as bad as you could get, not even the continental. And the other thing that should language be integrated or separated, and what are the mechanisms? I'm sure you'll go into this. The other thing that troubles me a great deal is that the advantage of doing Chinese studies in India, or being an Indian doing Chinese studies, is that you live in India, and that you already have inbuilt a comparative perspective, which is different to that which is produced in the West. Not different, but is new in a nuanced way, yes. And what really has upset me in looking at dissertation after dissertation on social science questions is that the authors never seem to have read a single issue of the Economic and Political Weekly, for instance, the standard reading on social science, on political economy and social science, or even for that matter, looked out the window at where they live, or reflected themselves. So I think that on themselves and on their lives. So I think that this is something that one really lacks, even when people do self-consciously comparative studies. I'm sure I have talked too much and said too much and aired too many of my own personal opinions, which I've aired before, but I would like to thank you for your attention and thank you for giving me complete fraud in this business, never earned a living in it, the chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that keynote address, which was, as always, lucid, illuminating, and thought-provoking. Patricia has put the problem out, as she put it. She has placed the issue of China studies in India in the larger context of development of sociological and anthropological thought and social sciences in the country, while bringing out various challenges and gaps that exist today that we need to deal with in the domain of China studies. Thanks, Patricia, for your remarks. I'll now invite Professor Madhvi Thampi, who is, as I mentioned earlier, leading this study on recent initiatives of China studies in India, and also more specifically the convener of this workshop. So Madhvi will share her thoughts on the workshop.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Khan, and also Patricia, for Patricia's own reviews, which have been very inspiring actually in thinking of this project, designing this project, and I'm really grateful to you for coming here today. I'm also grateful to each and every one of you for coming here on a cold January morning, and in a season which is full of conferences and events and classes, to make the time to come here. And I think that reflects a concern that is very widespread among us, that we still do not have an adequate, or even I would say partially adequate and holistic understanding of China and India, and that a lot needs to be done to remedy this. So I really I'm so glad that to find this hall quite full on this morning and that you all came. Forgive me if there are a lot of echoes of what the Ambassador Kant and you, Patricia, said in my work, but I'll be saying it much more prosaically and trying to explain what this project is about and what this workshop today is going to be about. Well, as Patricia said, the introspection about Chinese studies in India is not something new, but has been an ongoing exercise, not only on the part of ICS, but of most of us in this field. And that's why we have asked in today's discussion that we concentrate on recent initiatives. By recent, you can say between last 5 to 15 years or so. 13 years ago, another workshop on Chinese studies in India was held here in Delhi. It was organized by ICS and held in Delhi University. It had a representation from a very wide range of universities and people engaged in China studies across India. And that workshop resulted in a report and recommendations. Those of you who are interested can take a look at it. There are some copies near the table. Now, 13 years is a long time in today's world, and we felt the need to make an on-the-ground assessment of what has changed since that time. In the past few months, we have contacted a number of stakeholders to gather information and their views on this subject. Needless to say, this has been a labor-intensive exercise, and we are only about halfway through. And we expect this workshop to be a most important component of the review process. Now, I don't want to anticipate what the participants will be saying here over the course of the discussion today, but let me, in a few minutes, present in broad terms what, in my view, are some of the things that have changed and what have not changed, or sadly changed for the worse in the recent past with respect to Chinese studies in India. Well, in this exercise, as I told Patricia, I was really helped by her own review, which she did in 2011 at the 4th All India Conference of Chinese Studies, which was held in Hyderabad. Now, something that has changed is the greater number of players in the field. Or it may be better to call them stakeholders rather than players. There are more China studies centers now in Indian universities, both public and private. I mean, just to mention a few, Sikkim University, Doon, Central University of Gujarat, Jharkhand, NG University, Kottayam. Quite a few which were not there, 15 years ago, say. And we are very pleased that we have with us here scholars based in some of these newer centers who will be participating as panelists in the last session today. Their experience is most important in understanding the challenges in sustaining new centers of China studies across India. Even where there are no new centers as such, courses on China and especially the Chinese language are being offered in a far greater number of institutions than before. These are spread across India, and the students in them come from diverse states. To an extent, the problem of Delhi-centeredness, which was flagged by so many participants in the 2006 workshop, seems to be less prominent, though the problem has by no means disappeared. The number of research institutes or think tanks focusing on China has also expanded in the recent past. Apart from those which have the word China or Chinese in their names, there are also other institutes that have dedicated personnel studying and writing about China. Certain newspapers now have their own correspondents who regularly report from China. Additionally, we can include in the list of stakeholders in China studies in India those private foundations and trusts, especially those involved in developing higher education in India, who understand the need to put effort and resources into raising the quality of teaching and research, specifically on China in India. These institutions, which are based both in India and abroad, have helped to inject an element of dynamism in the otherwise earlier sleepy field of China studies in India. We're very glad that representatives from some of these institutions are with us today in this workshop, and we'll be listening to them shortly. We do not have a clear idea of the number of people in India today who are learning or have learned some Chinese. But it would not be wrong to say that in the last 2 decades there has been a huge increase in their numbers. The language skills of students and young researchers in China studies are much better compared to what they were 2 decades back, partly because a far greater number of them get opportunities to spend time in China or Taiwan. It is another matter whether those language skills are being put to use in research, to utilize Chinese source materials, or to conduct fieldwork in Chinese. Apart from those who attend the more formal courses in universities, there are countless others who learn Chinese in privately run institutes. Though these cater mainly to those working in the private sector or in tourism and related fields, I know of cases where they have helped to give a leg up to budding young scholars of China who haven't been able to access the university run courses. The number of Indian students learning Chinese would have been far greater if the efforts taken between around 2011 to 2013 to introduce teaching of Chinese in Kendriya Vidyalayas and CBSE schools had paid off. That was one initiative which was there, and it seems to have more or less shut down by around 2014-15. There is now one Kendriya Vidyalaya which has a China course with one person. Unfortunately, these efforts have mostly remained a dead letter except in some private schools in India. The growing interest in learning Chinese is linked to the increase in employment opportunities in the private sector for those with Chinese language skills, whether in Indian companies with business interests in China, in Chinese companies in India, or more generally in multinational firms. The job opportunities in business with relatively lucrative pay packets has meant, however, that many students do not continue with their study of Chinese or studies on China at higher levels. Some of those who do not opt to take up jobs in the private sector after their initial degrees in Chinese have gone to China or Taiwan for further studies on scholarships from those countries. The increasing number and variety of scholarships offered by China and Taiwan to Indian students is another change from the situation prevailing 15 to 20 years ago, and has reduced the dependence on the MHRD scholarships, which have hardly increased. However, it is not clear how, if at all, the increasing number of Indian students proceeding for studies into China or Taiwan has strengthened the serious study of China done in India. The 2006 workshop had drawn attention to the tendency in China studies in India to focus on a few heavily worked over topics, particularly relating to India-China relations. Although studies on China here are still overwhelmingly focused on IR and are often informed by the geopolitical rivalry between India and China, there has been greater diversity in the nature and range of subjects taken up for study and research by young scholars, as you were saying. A cursory look at the title of doctoral theses relating to China from universities like JNU in Delhi testifies to this trend. To take another example, the topics of articles written by applicants for a writing workshop which we conducted in Delhi on China in 2018 related to themes that included hydrology, energy, cartography, welfare regimes, labor and migration, cyber diplomacy, and so on. On the one hand, this venture into and engage with newer areas of research on China is heartening. At the same time, it is not clear that these young scholars are adequately equipped, as you were saying, with the appropriate methodologies and specialized knowledge needed to tackle these diverse subjects with a degree of competence. So overall, the proliferation of stakeholders, of China studies centers, and of students taking Chinese language or courses on China in the last 10 to 15 years has created an aura of activity or busyness in this field. Combined with the growing attention paid to China in the media, one could argue that things are progressing and that the days when a handful of China studies departments in universities carried on their work in isolation from the mainstream and away from the limelight are over. However, while the buzz about China helps to provide a conducive environment to attract or interest young people in studying China, it should not be equated with a sound ecosystem to pursue China studies here. Even less is it a sign that we now have an informed and holistic understanding of China. So all is really not well with the field of China studies in India. The problems of grossly inadequate funding and shortage of qualified teachers and of poor infrastructure continue to plague us. Employment opportunities in academia are inadequate to absorb even the small number of young scholars qualified to teach and do research on China. This acts as a disincentive to put in the hard work and extra years needed for those currently pursuing higher level studies on China and India. Support for and engagement with China studies in universities is often patchy and inconsistent, and dependent on the doggedness of individual faculty members or the encouragement of individual administrators, rather than the institution or the system as a whole. Closer engagement with Chinese academia, an absolute must to raise the level of China studies here, is not just at an abysmally low level, but has been increasingly stymied by policy-related and bureaucratic impediments. This in spite of the lip service paid to closer people-to-people contacts between India and China. The quality and rigor of the research being done on China and institutions is still far from attaining global standards. So I expect that we will hear a lot about this today, and these and many other shortcomings and problems. So I don't want to dwell further on them now. However, before concluding my remarks with an explanation of the structure and framework of today's workshop, I would like to briefly flag 2-3 issues which I feel need to be taken into consideration when we discuss what is the way forward for China studies in India today. Firstly, in our enthusiasm to implement new schemes or new programs, we sometimes tend to undervalue the old. It took many decades to build up certain core centers of China studies located in our public universities, to build up a critical mass of trained faculty, a tradition of research, library holdings, and so on. It is alarming to watch the whittling away of these institutions through cuts in grants, failure to fill vacant posts, or provide avenues for faculty advancement, career advancement, and general neglect. We must remember that some of the institutions around the world most renowned for their contribution to China studies have matured over a very long period of time. It is always good to be challenged by new institutions, but they cannot easily replace the old. The nurturing of these new institutions and programs needs to go hand in hand with the reinvigoration of those of long standing. Secondly, how do we, which is what, again, taking off on what Patricia said, how do we mainstream the study of China? Bring China into the discourse in various spheres of knowledge, not just IR, but the study of politics, economics, history, sociology, literature, as well as of environment studies, management studies, energy studies, gender studies, public health, science and technology studies, and so on. China challenges so many conventional science, social science theories and models that it should no longer be studied through the prism of Chinese exceptionalism, as Patricia had suggested in your 2011 speech. While we need to encourage and nurture China specialists who are adept in the Chinese language and deeply knowledgeable about China as a whole, we also need to work out strategies to bring study and research on China into other disciplines and areas of knowledge, and encourage both students and experts in those areas to take up the challenge of knowing China in more than a cursory way. Certainly there are steps being taken in this direction already, and maybe we will hear about some of them, but especially in comparative studies, but this has to be taken forward. Finally, we need to recognize the fact that much of the solid and pioneering research, even on India-China, that is India-China comparative studies, India-China relations, is being done not here but abroad. How do we, the Chinese studies fraternity in India, feel about this? Is this an issue for us at all? Do we just accept this as a fact of life, or do we seriously try to raise our game and take it as a challenge to produce studies and research here that is respected at a global level? So I look forward to a vigorous discussion in the rest of the day's proceedings. I'm very well aware that there are many ways one could have organized a workshop like this, review of China studies in India. Each one of us would probably have our own way of doing it. But in organizing this workshop here today, we have been guided by two main considerations. First, it is our understanding that everyone here today is, in their own way, a stakeholder in Chinese studies in India and can have something important to contribute to the discussion. Hence, we have opted for a more flexible format in which we will have panel discussions and a lot of time for people from the floor, if you want to call it that, there's no real floor here, to speak, rather than a paper presentation followed by Q&A type of sessions. So that's one thing. I would request those the panelists to try to limit their initial remarks at least to 10 minutes, to 10 to 15 at the maximum, and give time for the people from the floor to speak. Those who are intervening from outside the panel, I would request you to talk for 5 minutes and not more, so that we can have a free-flowing discussion, and to please relate your remarks to the given theme of that particular session. And then, depending on how much time we have left, the panel moderators can decide to go back to the panelists and to others for a second chance if we have that time. So, secondly, we are going with a thematic format in today's workshop. The engagement that we have had so far with people who we've contacted in the course of doing this project has shown us that there are certain common issues that everyone is concerned about. So instead of each participant presenting only about their own institution or their own area of specialization, we felt it would be good if we all focused on certain common areas of concern. Of course, by bringing in our own experience, as we understand it, through our own experience. Now, the 3 areas of concern, you may have seen it already in the program, firstly, the first session. The theme of the first session is really about how do we expand China studies. It's rather ridiculous that in a country of this size we have literally so few knowledge centers about China, and bring more people into the fold, while at the same time ensuring quality of the research and teaching that is done. That's the first theme. The second theme of the second session, which is the first session in the afternoon, is, on the one hand, how do we overcome the fragmentation that Patricia had also mentioned within the field between Chinese language and Chinese studies. These seem to be sometimes really hard to bridge the gap, and between Chinese studies and other branches of knowledge, other disciplines. At the same time, how do we maintain the distinction between different aspects of China research and China writing, the distinction between academic work, between policy-related research, and writing for the public, which is very important. All of them are very important, but they have their own uniqueness and should not be confused with each other. And the third session is really about what are some of the major constraints which we are facing at the present time in developing Chinese studies in India. So anyway, please feel free to give your views, not just on one of these, but on any of these 3 themes, but please do try to address yourself to the theme of the given session. So with that, thank you very much, and hand it back.
Thank you very much, Madhvi, for those remarks which provided an excellent, very useful overview of developments, recent developments pertaining to China studies in India, particularly since the workshop which was convened by ICS in December 2006. Madhvi has flagged issues that need to be addressed during course of discussions today. She has brought out advances that have been made in certain areas, deficits that exist, and in some areas where there has been regression. In fact, we have fallen behind compared to what we had the situation in 2006. Thank you very much for those remarks. We'll conclude the inaugural session, and now I'll pass on to Professor Srimati Chakravarti to conduct the first session, which is on scaling up, ensuring quality. Over to you, Srimati.
Good morning. First, I would like to compliment Professor Madhavi Trampi for organizing this very, very useful workshop. And I I would also like to thank her for giving me the opportunity to chair this session. Now, before I move to the distinguished panelists, I'd just like to make one point regarding my experience or my university's experience with China studies. For many, many years, my department only had an MPhil program and a PhD program in Chinese and Japanese studies. Most of our students came from the departments of history and political science, and these departments had full-fledged courses on Chinese history and Chinese politics. However, over a period of time, we found that our researchers do not have enough of a background, do not have what we call the fundamentals to be able to do useful research. So we introduced a program called MA Masters. We introduced a master's program in East Asian Studies, which included China, Japan, and Korea, and 16 courses over 4 semesters were taught to them, of which 4 were language courses. 4 courses were for language, either Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. And the other courses were on history, politics, sociology, international relations, and so forth. So there were both mandatory courses as well as optional courses. Now the program overall is successful in the sense that a good number of students are applying and joining. However, now it's like 10 years since the last group graduated. I'm still not sure whether it has helped in expanding the the research potential of China studies in this country. Many of the students get jobs in the private sector, as soon as they finish, so they don't go for research. And the others who go, regardless of what discipline they are coming from at the bachelor's level, prefer to do international relations. Many of them are students of Alka and Deepak maybe and others, and they prefer to work on international relations related topics. So this is one, I would say, one issue that we have to still handle. But of course, it is true that China studies has expanded over the last few years. Madhvi has rightly pointed it out, mainly because of the opening up of so many centers, which was the result of demand from the private sector. But that has its negative aspect. As I said, many people do not go and do research, because I was told by my colleague from Vishwa Bharati that they get large number of students to apply for the MA course, but after 3 years of bachelor's in Chinese, they get jobs in the private sector, so no one even goes for MA, forget about research. So these are issues that I think we will have to tackle, and I think only with more fellowships, more scholarships, more support from government and the private sector, probably we'll be able to overcome this, hopefully. Anyway, so now I move to our panelists. First person to speak is going to be Professor Tan Sen, who is at the Center for Global Asia, NYU Shanghai, and an old friend of ICS. Tan Sen, please.
Thank you, Shrimati. Thank you, Madhvi, for organizing this workshop. It comes as you know, at a time when I'm writing an article on the state of China-India studies, and you have seen a draft of that, and it's for me to learn where we stand. I would like to separate China studies from China-India studies. I think these two are different things. But I'm going to talk about the quality of training issue that is highlighted in this panel. And before I do, I would like to tell Patricia that there are a number of things we don't know about China-India connections. And since you emphasized sociology, one of the very important person that we overlook is Kumar Shanker, the sociologist who was in Shanghai and did some of the initial comparative studies of China and India, and his book on Chinese religions through Hindu eyes is absolutely fascinating. And also fascinating is the person who wrote a foreword to that book, Wu Dingfang, who was a Chinese theosophist, and the history of theosophy in China is another topic that has not been looked at. So there are, beyond the Freemasons, there are other topics. My book was not meant to be an encyclopedia, but I'll talk about the quality of training through my personal experience, and also as a student, as well as a researcher, and then now as the director of the center in NYU Shanghai. So many of you perhaps know that I did my undergraduate and master's in China, doing Chinese history at Peking University, and one of the things I did, my topic was Tang and Song dynasties, is to study classical Chinese, and we had to memorize and recite from historical dynastic histories and other things. So when I went to University of Pennsylvania, my advisor, one of my advisors, Robert Hartwell, who was one of these figures who couldn't speak any Chinese, but was the leading authority of Song history. Many of the Song historians today across the U.S. were actually trained by him. And he offered a very important course, which is called Sinological Methods. I'm sure Harvard probably has that. And two things we did in that course was to question Chinese sources, to have a critical perspective of Chinese dynastic histories, other kinds of sources that we read. And the second thing we also did was to have a critical reading of secondary sources, starting with how Fairbank looked at Chinese history to other people. And so that course was a real surprise to me, because this was the first time I was questioning many of the things in Chinese dynastic histories, or because he was doing Song history, some of the writings related to Song trade, for example, how problematic they are. I think that was one important part of my training, beyond just the Chinese language, and this is about analytical skills. So that gave me a very different perspective of using Chinese sources to what I wanted to do. My advisor at Penn was Victor Mayer, and he worked on Buddhism and China interconnections. He did two things. One, cautioned the Buddhist sources about not only about Buddhism in China, but Buddhism between India and China. So that gave me another perspective of another different kind of sources. So not all Chinese sources are similar. The Buddhist Chinese sources are very different from the dynastic histories and things. But he also encouraged us to go beyond China studies, and this relates to discipline issues, and he encouraged his students to do anthropology, for example, and at this time Arjuna Pudurai and Peter van der Veer were at Penn, and so we benefited from that perspective, which you'll see in my recent writings. I've been doing ethnographical and anthropological research in the study of the Chinese community as it spread from China. The third one was Romila Thapar. Just because I was an Indian, I should not presume I knew Indian history, and I think that's one of the problems that we have, the Indians doing China-India studies. We automatically presume we know Indian history, and Romila Thapar told me that I didn't know anything about Indian history. So her critique of my dissertation was really fascinating, and the book that came up did two things: Buddhism, diplomacy, and trade. I cautioned this notion of a decline of Buddhism in the 7th, 8th century. This was an established viewpoint. Kenneth Chen, leading scholar of Buddhism, had written about it. So this was questioning a secondary perception of what happened to Buddhism after the Tang Dynasty, and what happened to the China interconnections after that. So that was questioning the Buddhist writings as well as the secondary sources on Buddhism in China. So that was the start of me as a scholar looking at Chinese sources in a different ways, and this is I think the quality of training that comes not only from what you do but what your advisors encourage you to do. I think that's one important thing that when we're talking about China studies in India is to see what kind of advice students are getting from their advisors. I think it's key from my experience in China and the US. And that evaluation of Chinese sources continues when I'm writing a book on Shanker. And it's a very complicated, controversial topic because the Chinese scholars have their own view, a perception of Shanker. It starts with Liang Qichao in 1904, 1905. Comparing Shanker with Columbus, and from then on the perception of Shanker is a diplomat of peace and harmony. And if you have seen some of my recent writings, I've been questioning that narrative. It does not fit very well with the Belt and Road Initiative narrative of the Chinese government. But what surprises me is how other countries have accepted the Chinese narrative, including India. And that something relates to being uncritical of Chinese sources. And one thing that I see repeated among Indian scholars, China-India connection that they are doing is about Bodhidharma. He was most likely not an Indian. He was most likely a Persian. But I see that repeated in Mahabalipuram. But I think more surprisingly among scholars of India who accept this narrative without actually looking at the Chinese sources that relate to Bodhidharma. And I think this relates to the important issue of analytical skills. You do not just accept Chinese sources on their face value. So I think with doing Zhenghe has really helped me look at how Chinese sources from the Ming to the Qing actually differ on their view of Zhenghe themselves, which is totally neglected by Chinese scholars. And this is again, this interacting with Chinese scholars does not mean you perhaps will get the right views. I think you have to really look at the sources critically and come to your own conclusion. And so that's one aspect that continues to affect me as a scholar of Chinese history. This is early Ming, of course. The other one is something that I've been doing with Arunabh Ghosh at Harvard, the recent project on the Nehru papers. We have collected over 10,000 pages of Nehru's various papers that went across Nehru's desk, 47 onwards, which were declassified only recently. And we are doing a couple of things that relates to capacity building as well. We are looking not only at the IR issue, but other issues that show up in these papers. These are really fascinating aspects of what the Indian Foreign Ministry, the PMO, thought about China, and see the angles of cultural diplomacy that also appears in these papers, the delegations that went to China, or the delegations that and that has led us to many different angles. It's a collaborative project. We have included some PhD students. Shilpa Sharma from here, DU, is part of this project. And the idea is to have PhD scholars be part of this endeavor among various other scholars. There are some people who do film studies, there are some people who do literature. So we are looking at different angles with the Nehru papers as the central way of things that we have met at Harvard, we have met at Shanghai. Part of that project is to also understand the methodology of doing China-India studies. We did a panel at the AS in Bangkok, 4 or 5 of us, talking about what we think is the way to do China-India studies. And this is beyond the China issue that I was talking about. We are planning to actually do a special issue of a journal talking about how do we do comparative studies. So if you have not read Peter van der Veer has very interesting things to say about how do you actually do comparative studies, and methodologically that's quite important. But we come from different disciplines. What does comparative studies mean for a historian? What does it mean for somebody doing literature, somebody doing film studies? So we wanted to have that perspective presented to start launch a discourse on methods. The other issue is interdisciplinary studies. How do you actually do that? There's a lot of critique of interdisciplinary studies, but how do you deal with that? Also important is the part of connected history that Sanjay Subramaniam, writing about Indian Ocean, had brought up. But then that was again examined by Prasenjit Dwara. If you have not read the edited volume by Liz Berry and Dwara on Beyond Regimes, right? It has a very good introduction, and where Prasenjit actually comes up with his own methodological take on how to do China-India studies. So we are looking at that as well. What we have done recently, we just, Arunabh and I were at Christ, another institution that is part of this consortium. is to take the Nehru papers to the undergraduates and master's students. So we did a workshop there looking at how the Panchsheel Treaty, the so-called Panchsheel Treaty, actually came about. So in the Nehru papers, there is a fascinating array of sources from January 1954 onwards, how the Indian delegation in China actually started discussing with the Chinese, and you can see many kinds of contentions, many drafts, and how the drafts changed, and ultimately we have the April 28 agreement that appears in the UN Charter as well. So the MS students were looking at these kinds of changes that happen in a document, and not to just go with the document that was signed and then presented became the Panchsheel thing. But the problems that are associated with coming up with this very important treaty in 1954, and I think this was the reaction to this workshop was that the MA students, many of them do IR studies, had no idea that there was a background to this Panchsheel treaty, which was quite interesting. It showed the places where India and China disagreed and so forth. Again, methodologically promoting the study of analyzing primary sources. So that document or documents, even the Nehru papers, are quite important. I'll just end with another important thing that Patricia said, I think quite important. Can we have a non-Western perspective on China-India studies? And here I think if you have not read Chen Guanxin's idea, he has a book called Asia as Method, but he has also talked about China/India as method, where he emphasizes decolonizing Asian studies, including China studies by Indians, Indian studies by Chinese. I have issues with his arguments, but I think it's a good way of looking at what Patricia said. Is there an alternative to what is being done in the West? I would then, as part of quality issues, before you start your dissertation, I would highly recommend Peter van der Veer's work, Liz Berry's and Prasenjit's introduction to this volume, and Chen Guanxin, because I think the key to China studies or China-India studies is basically to do two things. One is the training aspect, and here it's with the teachers and the students. They have to work together in doing that. And I think the methodological and analytical skills are quite important, and that should be part of the training, but it should go beyond the training part. And when people are writing about China or China-India studies, they should think about questioning the existing narratives or the sources and see if they actually make sense, or is it something new that they are going to contribute. So ultimately what matters is, and this relates to the research output, the quality of research output. Are you doing something new, or are you repeating what has been done? And if you are not questioning the existing narrative, what are you doing? And one of the problems I see in this regard in India is it seems we are repeating the state narrative, and that seems to be in many cases a huge problem. We are not here to promote the India-China relationship, if you think you are academics, but to create new academic research output that will contribute not only to Indians, but also people doing China studies across the world and India-China studies across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tansen, for enlightening us about your evolution as a China scholar, and also letting us know about your research on this area, the kind of work that you're doing. And I'm really glad to know that Nehru is not on his way out, at least in academics. May I now turn to Professor Elizabeth Perry, who's the director of the Harvard Eng Institute. In fact, Professor Perry is one of the big major contributors to the growth of China studies in India. Through the ICS HYI multi-year fellowship, she has been helping us, in a great way, create a new, fresh band of scholars, China studies, by training them in language in China and in doing research at Harvard University. So may I now request Professor Perry to take the floor?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today, and I particularly thank ICS for organizing this occasion. I think it's wonderful every 10, 15 years to take stock of what is going on and reflect on the advances and the challenges to come. Let me talk briefly about the Harvard Eng Institute and why it's recently become involved in India-related studies, and then talk a bit about some of the initiatives that we've been attempting to promote and some of the successes and remaining challenges in those initiatives. Some of you have heard perhaps of the Harvard Eng Institute before. If so, quite likely you think that it's part of Harvard University. In fact, it's not. The Harvard Eng Institute is an independent foundation that was founded back in 1928. All of its money comes from one source, a man named Charles Martin Hall, who made a lot of money through the development of a process for refining aluminum. He founded Alcoa, the aluminum company of America. His sister had been a missionary in China, and so when he died, he decided to give a fair amount of money to found an independent foundation to promote higher education, particularly in China, but more broadly across Asia, with attention to humanities and social sciences, to the liberal arts, as a means of improving or advancing higher education in Asia, with special attention to China and to Chinese culture. The Harvard Eng Institute is located at Harvard University. It has a very close connection with it, and all of the directors, including myself, have been professors at Harvard University. In my own case, I'm a political scientist who focuses on China, but I'm also a comparativist, and for a comparativist interested in China, for not all questions by any means, but for some very important questions, comparisons with India seem particularly appropriate. So when I became director of the Harvard Eng Institute in 2008, I was interested in part in expanding the Harvard Eng's involvement in other parts of Asia. It already had many partnerships in mainland China by that point. It also had partnerships, very strong ones, in other parts of East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, in Southeast Asia as well, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Cambodia. I wanted to expand in a few key areas. One area actually was North Korea, and the Institute for the last 6 years has sent 6 scholars from North Korea to Canada to develop their expertise. But another very important area, I thought, was India. Why India? One is obviously the kinds of reasons that Ambassador Kanta mentioned, simply the growing importance of India in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the growing importance of India-China comparisons. There is also an academic significance here, I think particularly, of course, for anyone who's interested in comparative politics. China and India are two of the most fascinating and puzzling cases, because China and India both challenge, in fundamental ways, our most important conventional wisdom about how political regimes ought to operate. We normally think that democracy and development go hand in hand, and by that conventional Western social science wisdom, we might consider India to be a kind of precocious democracy. When it was set up in the late 1940s, it was not as economically developed as we normally assume is required for a robust democracy. And yet for 70-some years now, it has maintained a democratic system. We might think of China, on the other hand, set up almost at the same time, its modern state, almost at the same time as that of India, but we might think of China as a kind of prolonged autocracy. China, certainly for the last 40 years or so, has been developing faster than any country in world history, and yet its authoritarian regime seems as hale and hearty as ever, perhaps even more so than it was in previous periods. So both China and India challenge our common assumptions about regime type, the way in which democracy and development ought to go hand in hand. But there was a third reason that I was particularly interested in promoting China studies beyond, China studies in India, beyond the obvious importance of India or its comparisons to China, and that is that historically the Harvard Eng Institute had actually been involved in promoting India-related studies at a much earlier period in its own history. Back in the late 1920s, right after the Institute was founded in 1928, 29, and then through the 1930s and into the 1940s, it funded the Sino-Indian Institute in Peking, then known as Beijing, today Beijing, under the direction of the very colorful German and then Estonian aristocrat, sinologist and Sanskritologist, the Baron Alexander von Stale-Holstein. He directed this institute in Peking, which focused on Buddhist texts and compared Sanskrit original sutras to their Chinese translations. And his work and that of his students in Peking was immensely important for developing Sino-India comparisons in that period. The Harvard Eng Institute funded that institute in Peking. It also provided funding for a university in India, Allahabad University, now San Higginbotham University, because of the particular connections between one of the Harvard Eng trustees and Higginbotham. Edward Hume, who some of you may have heard of, I'm sure Professor Baruch knows Edward Hume, a very prominent medical missionary who had been born in India and practiced medicine both in India and China, very involved in setting up Yale China in Changsha. He was a trustee of the Harvard Eng Institute for many years and also helped to promote connections between the institute and India. But these connections had become quite dormant over the years. After Edward Hume passed away in 1999, he was succeeded on the Harvard Eng Board of Trustees by a well-known Harvard Sanskritologist, Daniel Ingalls, and the Institute set up Ingalls Fellowships, which brought some very prominent scholars from India to Harvard. But these were only a handful of scholars, and even that program had atrophied by the time I became director. And so I began to cast around for what might be some useful ways for the Institute to be more involved with India, and particularly with the possible promotion of India-China issues. I personally had been interested in India-China comparisons for some period of time. At Harvard, I had co-taught with Professor Devesh Kapoor, who's now at Johns Hopkins University, co-taught a course that we entitled Ruling the Asian Giants, a comparison of China and India. And both we and the students had become increasingly intrigued by these kinds of comparisons. And later on, Devesh and I worked together on comparisons of higher education in contemporary China and India. When I had been president of the Association for Asian Studies, one of those latter-day learned societies that Patricia mentioned, there was an opportunity to organize a roundtable, President's Roundtable, and the roundtable I organized was a China-India comparative roundtable, because that struck me as really the most important kind of question that we as Asianists could be promoting. And then in my early days as director of Harvard Eng, I reached out to my old friend and colleague Prasenjit Dwara, and suggested that together we might organize a series of workshops and conferences comparing China and India. At that time, Prasenjit was Director of Research at the National University of Singapore, and we held a series of conferences both at Harvard and at NUS comparing China-India, which resulted in the volume that Tansen mentioned, comparing China and India beyond regimes, and has a number of chapters. In fact, Mark has a chapter in that book, and Devesh Kapoor and I have a co-authored chapter, and Prasenjit and I co-authored an introductory chapter developing an idea of convergent comparisons, how we might look productively at China and India facing similar challenges, often at remarkably similar periods of time. But when I tried to figure out how the Institute could get more involved in India and raise this with my colleagues at Harvard, I was met almost universally by bemused skepticism. All the previous directors of Harvard Eng that I talked to told me, yeah, they had idealistic thoughts of doing something in India, but it had never quite worked out. When I went to my senior colleague, the late Rod McFarquhar, the great political scientist of China, who, like all the other greats of his time, could not speak Chinese, but had remarkable facility in reading Chinese and doing research on it. Rod had been born in India and spent his youth here and was committed to India-China comparisons, but he told me he had tried, and I really shouldn't waste my time doing this. I reached out again to my friend Prasenjit and asked him, and Prasenjit said, "This is a wonderful idea, but I just don't see how you can possibly do it." But then a couple years later, Prasenjit came back and he said, "I think there may be some light here. I've talked to people at the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi, and they seem interested in doing some things, and also seem interested in partnering with those from abroad." And so, very kindly, Professor Alka Acharya invited me to come here to present the Gary Deshinger Memorial Lecture, and I took advantage of that opportunity to discuss with her and also with Professor Mohanty this idea of developing a joint PhD fellowship in Chinese studies for PhD students here in India that would bring together the training in Chinese language and training in a particular discipline in the humanities or social sciences. And so in 2014, we launched this joint fellowship program. It's a multi-year fellowship program where ICS covers the India portion of the training, and the Harvard Eng Institute then sends these fellowship recipients for 1 or 2 years to China, 1 year to improve their Chinese language, if that requires additional work, a 2nd year to do serious field work on their dissertation in China, and then what is either a 2nd or a 3rd year, depending on how much time they spend in China, they spend at Harvard University working with Harvard faculty to improve their dissertation before returning here to India to complete the PhD. So far, including our latest group, the day before yesterday, we interviewed 19 candidates, and including that latest batch, I think we will to date have had 14 of these multi-year fellowships, and we have just renewed our agreement for another 3 years. This program, I think, has had no difficulty with quality. We've had outstanding young scholars from very diverse fields: literature, history, cinema studies, African studies, anthropology, politics, international relations, and more. The quality has been high, but there remain a couple of concerns. One is the need to expand diversity in other directions. We have good diversity in terms of discipline, good diversity, good balance in terms of gender. But of the 14 fellowship recipients to date, 8 of them are from JNU, 3 are from Delhi U. One is from Dune, one from Mumbai, and one from Birya Institute of Technology and Science. And so expanding outward is one of the big challenges for this fellowship program. We're very pleased that our Harvard Eng alumni, who include not only these fellowship recipients, but recipients of the earlier Ingalls fellowships and recipients of some ad hoc fellowships that Harvard Eng has provided to promising young Indian scholars, have founded a Harvard Eng Alumni Association here in India, and they have taken it upon themselves to very proactively advertise the fellowship at various academic fora. And so the number of applicants we're getting is expanding, the quality is increasing, and we're hopeful that this will become more diverse in terms of geography in the future. An even bigger concern has been the difficulty in finding suitable teaching positions for those who complete their PhD degrees. As you know, there have been difficulties with JNU and Delhi U not actually hiring new faculty, and particularly in the areas of Chinese studies. And so we have realized that our focus increasingly needs to be on the private colleges and universities. For the past couple of years, the Harvard Eng Institute has collaborated with the United Board of Christian Higher Education in Asia and Christ University in Bangalore on a teacher training program for professors and instructors at private colleges and universities who are interested in introducing China material into their courses. But Harvard Eng does these training programs only for a couple of years at a time in any particular field, and so we've also been seeking a more sustainable way of increasing interest in Chinese studies at the private colleges and universities. And so with encouragement from my Harvard colleague Arunabh Ghosh and former Harvard colleague Pratap Mehta, we've also been discussing with Ashoka and with the China-India Foundation the possibility of launching a new